I'm an 18-year-old female, and this happened to me just last week while working. For context, I work for a widely popular pizza chain around the country as a delivery driver. I won't name the place or location. I'm not getting paid for advertisement. Anyway, the restaurant was busy all day every day, which meant that I'd be doing deliveries left and right. Business wouldn't start to slow down until at least an hour before closing, so it was hectic to say the least. One night, my boss had called me in on my day off, asking if I was able to work that night as someone had called out. After all, I wasn't really doing anything that night, so I said why not and drove over to work. The second I get there, I clock in, and it was then when our phone rang with a man's voice requesting a large pie. However, the second he knew I was a female, the tone in his voice completely changed. In a sort of flirtatious manner, he had given me the address and how he wanted the pizza delivered. I told my coworker that I needed one regular and to hand it to me when ready. It was then when I noticed the order barely met our delivery radius, and I even asked my boss if it was still worth doing. I could tell he was in sort of a rush and didn't have time for questions or concerns, so I decided to do it. I put in the guy's address and went on my way to do what I hoped was my last delivery. It wasn't too far out, but it was then when I realized that the area I was in wasn't the best in town. It was one of those areas with run-down homes and unkept lawns where you'd commonly hear sirens every now and then. And being a small, petite college student, it was concerning being around here as crime here was at its highest. It was sketchy, but knew I could finally go home once I completed the delivery. I pull up to the townhouse my GPS led me to and immediately see that there were no cars in the driveway. However, there was a single light on, meaning there was indeed someone home. For those of you who don't know what a townhouse is, it's basically several homes fused together into one. Anyway, I step out of the car with the pizza in hand and knocked on the door as there was no doorbell. Within a minute, the door opens and I was greeted to a man who appeared to be in his mid-20s wearing, out of all clothes, a tuxedo. He was tall and his hair was a mess and honestly looked disheveled. The smell of strong alcohol could be noticed from his clothes, which wasn't attractive at all. He greeted me, introducing himself as Nate, and immediately grabbed the pizza from my hands. He opens it and looks back at me with a smile and says, "You know, I wouldn't be able to eat this pizza by myself. Would you mind coming inside to share?" I uncomfortably laugh and politely decline, telling him I had to go home and that I had to watch the carbs. However, he then insists, telling me how he was this great guy and how he could buy me all these nice things. This time in a more direct tone, I tell him no thank you, but that he was very thoughtful and to have a nice night. Suddenly, he then stops me, telling me he forgot to give me my tip. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a $5 bill and handed it to me, making sure our hands touched. Now, this is the part where things really took a turn for the worst. As I was about to turn around and leave to go home, I hear clear as day this loud and blood-curdling scream from upstairs. He looks up at the pitch-dark hallway of his house and then back at me. It was then where his demeanor completely changed. This time, in a more serious tone of voice, he had said, I think it's time for you to go." I felt my blood run cold as he said this and ran back to the car, pulling out of his driveway, not looking back. As I'm in the car, I'm calling my boss, who was still at the restaurant, practically crying to him about the situation. He had said to come right back and that he was calling the police. When I arrived, police were already outside waiting with my boss. For a good while, I was questioned and gave them the address I made the delivery to. It's safe to say I didn't hear anything from police for a good week until I finally got a call back. Turns out, the man who I had made the delivery to had actually owned the house with his parents. The woman screaming was his now ex-girlfriend who he had caught cheating with another man. The part that disturbed me the most was that he had beat her numerous times after he found out. She had been in his house for days and wouldn't let her leave until she, quote, learned a lesson. He was obviously arrested, and his ex was taken to a hospital where she thankfully did survive. The next day, I quit my job and now work as a desk representative. If there's one thing I've learned from this, is that always trust your gut when something feels off. Around 3 years ago, I did deliveries for my dad's pizza business to make extra money for a car I wanted. I had just turned 17 and would do several deliveries for my dad whenever I could. I hated the idea of running the register or doing dishes, so my dad let me do deliveries instead. Realistically speaking, I'd work maybe 15 hours a week to help with my dad, and being a small business, we'd maybe get about 4 or 5 deliveries a day. If we didn't get deliveries that day, I'd always help my dad with cooking whenever he needed it. One night before closing, I had been sweeping the floor when my dad asks me if I could do one last delivery. I was tired, but knowing how hard my dad worked and how badly I wanted that car, I agreed. The customer who had ordered was located on the opposite side of town, which meant it would be a longer drive. I put the order into the back of the car, a single large pie, and got on the road. My GPS led me to the more rural side of town, the type of place where you would commonly see run-down homes and stuff like that. I had already been skeptical of this part of town, but realized it was another tip at the end of the day. I arrived to the house and I immediately noticed the red flags. Not a single light was on inside, and there were no cars in the driveway. A chill ran down my spine as I saw this, as I had never seen anything more sketchy. However, I always knew that you had to do things in life you didn't want to do, so I bit my lip and walked up to the house. The doorbell was completely damaged, so I knocked. Silence filled the air until I very faintly heard footsteps approaching the door before it opened. Standing at the door was an older-looking man, maybe in his 50s, giving me a friendly smile. This made me a bit more relieved now that I felt greeted, but was still hesitant. He politely asked if I was the pizza guy, to which I replied with a yes and handed him his food. For whatever reason, I asked him why all of the lights were off in his house. There was a short pause before he finally said it was because the power went out in his neighborhood. However, that's when I noticed that the rest of the homes had at least one light on, so I knew this was a lie. Not wanting to pry and too tired to care, I tell him to have a good night and went on my way. He then stops me and tells me he wanted to give me something special for being such a good person. This was weird, but I walked over to him and he then tells me to follow him inside. It was at this point where something told me to not do it and to get back in the car. I simply just stood by the door while he insisted I come inside. Now this is the part where things would have taken a terrible turn. As I was standing by the door frame, I could very faintly see by the stairs someone wearing what appeared to be a white mask. The man saw the look on my face and must have caught on to my suspicions. At that point, I run back to the car and drive the hell out of there, not looking back. I take a look in my rearview mirror, and thankfully nobody was following me as I left. All the while, I'm hyperventilating while on the phone with my dad, telling him everything. He had told me that he'd be on the phone with the police and to come straight home. Long story short, I was questioned by the police when they asked me to name the address. As it turns out, that house had been vacant for years as nobody ever lived there. Needless to say, police still went to that house, but like in most situations like this, whoever was there was gone. I still work for my dad's business, but we made a new rule where we wouldn't accept deliveries past a certain time. It's been a few years now, and nothing has happened since. This incident still comes back to me once in a while, and makes me think about what would have happened had I not seen the man in the mask. I worked as a delivery driver at my local Pizza Hut when I was a sophomore in college. It wasn't the best paying job, but it was enough to where I could pay bills and other things I wanted. Being a full-time student, I had a flexible work schedule, meaning I'd only work a few times per week. My typical hours were the weekends, which were the busiest days seeing as there were more customers. This incident happened on a Friday night while I was out doing deliveries. For context, I live in a small town of Tennessee, so there would be a lot of land around the area and nobody out on the road. The delivery I had gotten was located on the other side of town, where the more wealthier people resided. This was a plus, as the wealthier people tend to tip more and were generally a lot nicer than most people. I was on a long road with forests on both sides trying to get to the destination when, out of nowhere, I see a car tailing behind me. This wasn't common, as these roads are mostly quiet during this time of night. For some reason, I had this feeling of dread inside and figured this person was up to no good. All the while, the car's horn is blaring nonstop to the point where I was trying to figure out what they wanted. All of a sudden, I hear the voice of a man from the car say something, but because of the wind, I couldn't hear him. That's when I slowed down where he yelled again, and that was when I could hear something along the lines of, "Your car's on fire." I look in my rearview mirror, and the trunk is full on smoking with small flames coming from my wheels. How I didn't see this, I have no idea, but I start screaming and pull over while running out of the car. Thankfully, the driver of the other car got out and made sure I was okay. Suddenly, a loud boom can be heard from the car, and half of the car is now in flames. Now, this is the part where I could only describe to be the work of God. Turns out, this driver wasn't even supposed to be on this road. He had been coming home from work when, for whatever reason, he got this urge to turn onto the street even though it was the wrong way. The feeling was so strong that he thought he was crazy, but decided to finally do it, and that's when he saw me. When he said that, I stood there in utter shock. It took a while, but fire rescue came to put it out while I informed my boss. Unfortunately, the fire department couldn't figure out as to what caused the fire. I had taken a week off from work after that, and all delivery vehicles were inspected. Till this day, I thank that driver for getting me to notice, as I thought he didn't have good intentions. If there hadn't been someone on that road that night, God only knows what would have happened to me. Thank God for that driver, and thank God I finally noticed. When I was around 24, I lost my full-time job as a freelance writer due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It got really bad around my area to the point where the company was losing money and had to lay off many workers. Because of this, I became broke and nearly got evicted from my apartment. During this time, I had my parents help out with rent and did DoorDash on the side to make some extra income. It wasn't the best paying job, but it helped me get around and paid for things I needed. I ended up doing deliveries pretty often and thought it was the perfect little side hustle. One night, I had been doing deliveries around the suburbs of my city. This was the type of area where you'd normally get more orders, which typically meant you'd get more money. So, I'm driving around when I get a delivery from a local mom and pop type of restaurant. It was a large order, and the person who had ordered it was on the other side of town, which was annoying. However, DoorDash charges more per mile, and seeing as it was a large order, I realized it was a bigger tip. Sucking it up, I drive the 25-minute drive to the given address and eventually pulled into a house with an unkept driveway. The house seemed okay, but the grass was tall and there didn't appear to be any lights on. This should have been the first red flag, but being young and naive, I dismissed it and proceeded with the order. Now, DoorDash has the option for a customer to request their order be left by the door, which is exactly what this person wanted. I walk up to the house, and as I'm about to put their order down, the front door opens where I was greeted to a man. He looked as if he had just woken up and said in a groggy voice if I was the delivery guy. Clearly annoyed, but not trying to be rude, I tell him yes. Then, for whatever reason, he asks me if I could bring it to his backyard for him, as that's where all of his guests were gonna be. Why he was having guests over during the pandemic was his problem, but I wasn't gonna get involved. While his request was weird, I didn't think much of it, as it was a large order and was definitely something you couldn't feed one person. Without hesitation, I make my way to the back, and right when I turn the corner, I see 4 chairs and a dining table beside a shed. As I put the food on the table, I look at the shed and thought I could see someone looking at me through the window. Even with it being dark out, I could still make out the face to be a woman. However, the weird part about it was that she appeared to be sad for some reason. It was kind of like that look you would give someone as if their whole life was falling apart. The closest term I could really describe it was depressed or disappointed. It was then where the man had come out and thanked me for my help. I then leave the house to go back home, still confused out of my mind. It wasn't until about a week later where I had met up with a friend in the area when I learned a harsh truth. I had told him about my weird delivery trip the other night to that man's house. Upon describing the man, he said he knew who I was talking about and he would do deliveries for him here and there. It was then where I had mentioned the woman I had seen, and that's when he told me something I didn't know. My friend and this man had managed to strike up a conversation one day and told him something personal. Turns out, his wife had suffered from a heart attack in his backyard one day and didn't survive. He was heartbroken and obviously grieved for a long while after her passing. From time to time, he had caught glimpses of her inside of his gardening shed, as she always loved planting. That was her go-to place for whenever she was feeling down or upset. Gardening was always her passion, and she'd do it whenever she could. That was the creepiest and saddest experience I've ever had while on any shift.
I recently moved across the country to a new town to go to school. I was able to land a job as a pizza delivery driver pretty easily. I've done this job before, and I like it because it's relatively easy and I make good money on tips. I work a lot of really late night shifts. A couple of weeks ago, I was working and at about 2 a.m. an order came in. It was for a large cheese pizza. At that hour, it was just a couple of us working, so I made the pizza myself and then put it in my car and went to deliver it. I didn't know the area very well, so I would always put the address in on my phone and then just follow the directions. I got in my car and typed it in. It said it was a 15-minute drive. As I drove, it seemed to be taking me into the middle of nowhere. I drove for about 10 minutes through woods with not a building or house in sight. Then finally, I was supposed to turn onto a little dirt road that I could barely see. If it hadn't showed up on my map, I would have almost certainly missed it. I slowed down and then turned onto the little dirt road. The map showed me continuing on this road for about 1 more mile, and then I would take a left, and the destination would be there. I began driving down the dirt road, which was surrounded by woods. Then suddenly, my phone lost signal. I wasn't all that surprised being so far out from the city, but I was concerned because I needed to find the house to deliver the pizza. I kept driving very slowly and looked for a road on the left side. Finally, I saw it and I turned. The road was another dirt one, but the woods on each side was even more dense. It was very eerie being out there on that road at that time of night, especially not knowing where I was. I drove down the road very slowly, looking on both sides for a house or some kind of building for whoever ordered a pizza out here. But all I saw was trees from the dense woods and some grass. I still had no service at all on my phone, but I knew I had to be close to where the delivery was supposed to be. It was very dark and hard to see, with the only lights coming from my headlights. I wasn't seeing any kind of buildings at all. I started to get a really creepy feeling being out there, and after about 5 minutes of driving down that road looking, I decided to turn around and go back, because I could clearly see that there was no buildings. I drove my car back to the other dirt road, and then back to where I had signal before. At last, I was finally able to get connection on my phone, and when I did, I looked at the map again, but the address had been erased and it was not there. I found the card that I had wrote the address on and put it back into my phone, but this time it said address not found. I decided I would just head back and try to figure out what was going on. When I got back to the store, I showed my boss the address and told him what happened. He looked surprised when I gave him this information. Then he told me that there are no houses or buildings in that area at all. I went back to look at the order that had come in, but it was gone. I chalked it up to a lack of sleep, but to this day, I really don't know how to explain what happened. Maybe I was just really tired, but it was still a really creepy experience. I am a pizza delivery driver. This was by far the scariest thing to happen to me. It took place about 1 year ago. I was working on a Thursday night, which were usually decently busy. I made quite a few deliveries, and the later it got, the more things calmed down. At about 1 in the morning, I got a delivery for a cheese pizza. I put it into my car and drove to the location, which was about 10 minutes away. It was in an area of town which I rarely delivered to and was a little more run down. I got to the address, which was a 2-story house with a pretty decent-sized yard and many overgrown plants and trees. It looked a little bit run down like most houses in the area and had a front porch that seemed to wrap around the house. I got out of my car, grabbed the pizza, and walked up the driveway to the house. Then I walked up the steps to the door and rang the doorbell. About 30 seconds went by, and I was about to ring the bell again when the door started to open. A man answered. He was fairly large and bald and looked to be in his 50s. He just stood there staring at me for a second. I said I had his pizza and handed it to him. He looked almost surprised and said, "Oh, okay, that's nice." Then he just looked around. He just seemed a little bit strange to me. Then he said to me that he had to get some cash to tip me and he would be right back. He went back inside and closed the door. I stood there waiting for a good 2 or 3 minutes, but the man still didn't return. I was thinking about just leaving when I heard some noise and figured the man must be coming back. But when I listened closer, it wasn't coming from inside. It was coming from outside on the porch. I looked around to the direction of the noise. Then I saw from the side of the house on the porch 3 men approaching me about 30 feet away. I guess it was just an instinct, but as soon as I saw them, I turned and sprinted back down the porch to the driveway. When I did, I heard all the men start to chase after me. I ran as fast as I could to my car and unlocked it and then jumped inside. I frantically started the engine and stepped on the gas. As soon as my car started moving forwards, the men reached me. I felt one of them kick my back door and another one tried opening the door on the other side, but I was just barely able to drive away. I sped out of the neighborhood and all the way back to the pizza place. I have to think that the pizza delivery was some sort of trap to lure me into getting robbed, or maybe even worse. I haven't delivered to that area much since, but when I do, I'm extra careful.
So, I had this part-time job when I was in high school, working as a pizza delivery driver for a large pizza chain. I saw some pretty wild stuff on the job, but only one thing that actually seriously creeped me out. I'm making this routine delivery to some innocuous-looking house, but when the guy answers the door, he just sort of grabs the pizza, thrusts a fistful of ones in my face, then slams the door behind him. At first, I'm just like, rude. But then when I count the money, I find that not only has this guy not given me enough for his 20-inch meat lovers, but he's not even bothered to tip me. I'd been burned once or twice before when it came to my count, and the difference ended up coming out of my wages, so I was not about to let that nonsense happen a third time. I ended up banging on the guy's door for like a solid 5 minutes before he answered. Like I could see him moving around behind the frosted glass panel, but totally ignoring my knocking. In the end, I lose my temper and say something like, "Hey man, don't try and finesse me out of money. I don't want to have to call the cops, but I will." Boom. Those were the magic words. He comes right up to the front door and opens it up. Not all the way, maybe a third of the way open. This guy is saying sorry a whole lot. Like almost too much. He's all pale, he's sweating, his hands are shaking as he passes me out a 20, just laying the sorry the whole time. I'm just thinking, what's this guy's problem? But then I catch a glimpse of something in the hallway behind the guy, and suddenly I've got a good idea what the guy's deal was. There's a dark red stain on the wooden floor, maybe the size of a manhole cover, and next to it are what look like all kinds of different cleaning products. I take one quick look at that, then at the guy, and he just slams the door in my face. I'm back in my car and speeding back to the pizza place faster than you can say F that. And as soon as I get there, I call the cops. As it turned out, I had legit interrupted this guy cleaning up a murder. And from what I heard, the guy was having an affair with a high school girl that was like 30 years his junior. She's over at his place while his wife is out of town, orders pizza at some point, then before it even arrives, the guy kills her because she's threatening to ruin his marriage or something. He had no clue that she'd ordered the pie, panics when I show up at the door, and that's how he got caught. Crazy story, right? But for me, the craziest part isn't so much the whole murderous infidelity thing. It's that before she was murdered, this girl unwittingly kicked off a chain of events that would catch her own killer. I had to go to court a bunch of times too, since I was basically the case's star witness, and it was so freaky seeing that guy looking at me when I talked to the prosecutor. He'd literally killed a girl with his own hands, and there he was, giving me death stares. Like I said, I've seen some wild stuff working pizza delivery, but only one thing that gave me nightmares. That guy's eyes.